Welcome to today's Exeter Institutogram conversation with myself, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Today we're going to be discussing a field which is, highly politicized in the way in which many areas of the study of Islam are, with my guest, Najam Haider, who is a professor of religion at Barnard College and at Columbia University in New York. We'll be talking about the field of early Islam, but also about his recent new book as well. So I'm just waiting for Najam to come through. It should be connecting soon. Let's see what happens. Right, we're just waiting for Najam. He recently published a book called The Rebel and the Imam, which is a study of early Islamic narratives. Let me see what's going on here. Oh. Right, maybe this will work. So just waiting for, oh yeah, it's working now. Hi, Najam.
Hey, how are you?
Okay, good, that worked. Yeah, I was wondering what was happening because it was kind of working through. So anyway, Najam, welcome to today's conversation. I just did a very brief introduction saying who you were, and that we'll be talking about the study of early Islam, which I described as probably the most politicized area of the study of Islam. Maybe the only exception to that list could be the study of violence in Islam, at least in the contemporary. But so just to kind of start you off on something which is straightforward, could you say something about what attracted you to the study of early Islam and why you basically define yourself in this field?
Well, that's a complicated question. You may or may not know that my initial degree wasn't in history or Islam. It was in physics. So I
Oh,
did
that's
physics.
yeah.
And then I got a scholarship after college to go to Syria for a Fulbright to learn some Arabic. And I also got a scholarship to study at Oxford.
Right.
Um, and at the same time, I had decided I wanted to go to law school, so I got into law school. So I
Okay.
went and did my Fulbright, and then I decided to go to Oxford for my master's, and it was just supposed to be something I did, and then I
Right.
would go and live my life as a productive member of society.
Of course, yeah. As opposed to
Instead,
being an academic, yes.
exactly. Instead, I ran into Chase Robinson, who was my advisor at Oxford, and I just started studying history. And one of the big things for me was reading, as it is for many Muslim graduate students, was reading Hagerism
Of
and
course,
coming
yeah.
across some of these problems with the source material and trying to think about what we actually know about early Islam.
Mm.
And I think, like many graduate students, I went in this direction where I felt like I needed to defend Islam. In
Right.
some ways, I needed to show that it wasn't all problematic source-wise and disprove Hagerism once and for all, and this entire group of skeptical historians and scholars that were out there.
Yeah.
And that sort of launched it because then I just fell into that completely. And so I spent really the next 2 years and then the next 5 years after that, and then my whole entire graduate career struggling with this issue of the source material in early Islam. And it
Yeah.
appealed in a lot of ways to my I guess my scientific mind, because I mean I'm still feel very influenced by my physics background. And it was this problem, and it was a way to unpack this problem. And what I enjoyed about early Islam was that we had so little data and so few data points that to actually work through those materials was a real challenge. And so, I mean, I think the puzzle of it appeals to me more than anything else. The
Right.
politics is
Yeah.
probably the least, um, probably the thing that gives me the most headaches and makes me rethink whether
Yeah.
this was the right choice or not.
Yeah, and I guess there probably are some people who are in it primarily for the politics, but that's a different matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people like your rumble. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I guess maybe you can kind of say a bit more about why this is, in a sense, such a problematic field. I mean, because certainly in terms of the data, you said the data is rather limited, but it seems to me from what I'm gathering from those looking at things like inscriptions and other kinds of
Mhm.
material culture artifacts and so forth, that actually the data we have is certainly a lot more extensive than we have for many points in late antiquity.
Mhm.
Um,
I
so
think that,
yeah,
I mean, I think that that is very much of a more recent development. Like I think in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a lot more work that's been done on archaeological evidence, inscriptions, papyra that they found, um, uh, coins. I mean, a lot more work is being done on material culture, as you said,
yeah,
and that gives us some insight, but not really considerable insight. I mean, I think part of the problems that we have in the study of early Islam is that for a long time, and I would say for hundreds of years, I mean, from the beginning of Orientalism, at least, we can say that this narrative of what early Islam was reified and put forward as the most knowable version of a monotheistic faith. So it's like
yeah,
the historical Muhammad existed, but the historical Jesus and the historical Moses, we don't, who knows what was going on there. And the idea was that we had these sources, and these sources were so extensive, and they carried with them chains of transmission, and they carried with them all of these signs of authenticity and veracity that we felt very, very confident that we knew what Muhammad's lifetime was like, what his community
yeah,
was like, what the early period was like. And so people just, gravitated to that. It became so central, that those literary sources became so central to our conceptions of early Islam, that when they began to be called into question, the immediate response, not just from Muslims, but from scholars of a particular generation, was
yeah,
to resist that revisionism, absolutely. And then, but when you sort of peel back one layer of the sources that we have, we find that most of them are much later in composition.
yeah,
That's not to say that they don't date to an earlier period, but to unproblematically make an argument that a source from 150 years after an event,
mhm,
um, even in a society where orality is prized, can in some ways reflect what happened 150 years ago.
yeah.
Exactly, or with veracity, with voraciousness, I think is very difficult. And so I think new generations of scholars are beginning to bring in other types of material,
Sure.
and beginning to question and revise and think about what we actually know about the early period. But we're just coming out of this period of chaos where everything that people thought was solid suddenly didn't seem solid anymore. And I think that's what the reaction really is. That's what the
Right.
crisis feels like. It's not that, as you said, it's not that there's not ways to do early Islamic history. There are, but it's this idea that 150 years of how this was done
Mhm.
was called into question in a span of a decade or two, and the field really hasn't fully recovered from that yet, I think.
But I think it's also, isn't it, the fact that this kind of this argument about the literary evidence is has become so sort of futile almost, where you're basically just like trading ideological positions in many
Yeah.
cases. So one then has to think about what is there beyond the so-called literary evidence, and it can't just be a case of one type of method being married with one type of philology, and
Mm.
there's got to be something more to give in terms of this the study of that evidence, and also for example, things like where does, say, the Quran fit into all this? It seems that to a certain extent, Quranic studies is developing in another kind of almost parallel way
Mm.
to these sorts of arguments at the moment as well.
No, no, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the biggest frustrations I have, and leaving aside Quranic studies for a second, because I do think it has developed its own uh, sort of scholarly bubble
Yeah,
community. The debates that happen in Quranic studies are quite different from what happens in other fields related to early Islam.
yeah,
Um, the frustration I feel very strongly is between those two camps that you mentioned. It's this idea of radical revisionism,
Mm.
unweighted from the literary sources at all, which almost dismisses the sources themselves as not really providing much of value, other than a later impression of an earlier period. And then the other position, which is just ideologically so invested in those sources themselves that they can't look beyond that. I mean, so the question we have to ask is there a way to sort of marry, well, that's not the right word. Is there a way to work through the source material in a more intelligent way that gets us to something that is useful?
Yeah.
And there are certain scholars and certain pieces that have appeared in the last 15, 20 years that do just that, that very reasonably engage the source materials in a critical way. And you know, it may, whether it's surprising or not, in many of those cases, what we find is that the larger span of our understanding of early Islam actually seems to align with the sources that we have. So much of the classical narrative survives.
Yeah.
In research that takes, that I feel is more balanced. There's obviously other people out there who produce incredibly revisionist works, and I don't know about.
To be honest, I don't think the word revisionist is useful. I think we should just call it what it is, which is skeptical. I mean,
Yeah.
I think revisionism actually. I had an argument about this recently or something else, but it depends. So some people, as you know, think revisionism is central to the way in which the dynamic of history or the study of history works. And of course, if you put it in that way, then describing this kind of ideological body of scholarship as revisionism is necessarily valuing it as the only way to do things.
Right.
So that's why I think it's actually more useful just calling it skeptical.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. I'm using the term in the sense that that's how the scholars themselves refer to their own work.
Yeah, but I think that's
but
because they're privileging themselves over others. So
that might be true. I mean, I have no that position to me it was exciting at first, and I'm a student of someone who would describe themselves as a skeptic, happily, but it lost its thrill very fast, and now a lot of the studies that emerge in this vein just feel somewhat vacuous to me. I mean, I can't motivate myself enough to get into them, especially the ones that are more on the outside edge of plausibility.
Yeah. So like
Shoemaker's work.
Where did this really happen?
Yeah.
What are the timelines? Nothing's really happening in Mecca.
I mean,
who knows what Mecca is?
I mean, I found a word under another word in a manuscript, and on the basis of that, I constructed an entire history of early Islam, which may or may not.
I mean, there's kind of all sorts of genetic fallacies going on, along with etymological ones. But can you give me, and those who are listening to this, an example of maybe one or two works which you think are really useful in terms of moving the field forward? I mean, apart from your own work, which we'll come to. But if you give me one or two examples of works on the study of early Islam which you think have been useful.
I think Martin Hines' work in general is quite good. I mean, he died very young, but he has a collection of works. He was a collaborator of Patricia Crone, but he has a collection of works on Kufa and Siffin, where he shows just the kind of work that you can do as a careful historian, working through the source material to figure out, what these societies really look like and what these factions, these political groups, factions might not be the right word, what they represented in a city like Kufa. So Hines is someone whose work I really respect. Chase Robinson himself had has an article on, I believe it's the conquest of Kuistan, where he starts the whole article with, let's see, we think that this conquest is being depicted in a very rote or a very rote way, so we think that it may not actually be reflected.
Not argument.
Yeah. But he goes, well, let's look at exactly what we know. And using local histories, he shows that actually the narrative that we have, which we may have doubted just on the basis of its similarity to other conquests, holds up. I mean, it holds up in the local histories, and it seems to be a reliable depiction of the early period. So, I mean, those are two people who I think are worked well in the balance between the skeptics or the revisionists, whatever you want to call them, and an older school of scholarship. I also think that there's just a lot of exciting work happening around different sources and different questions. I mean, I really think that the key in early Islam is developing your own methods, like new methods for the study of the early period. I mean, a book that was particularly eye-opening to me was Lior Halavi's work on Muhammad's grave, where he goes through funeral rites and rituals, and through that sort of deconstructs what the early ulama looked like, or what a scholarly identity looked like, and really does an amazing job of working through material that isn't ostensibly about his subject matter in a way that I think is interesting. And I think that's really where, if you're going to look at people, if you're going to examine the literary sources themselves, the real exciting work that's happening is people who are finding ways of engaging this material to get information in ways that aren't straightforward, and that involves a good deal of creativity.
Yeah.
And that's in addition to just people who are working with papyri, people who are working with archaeological sources. I mean, I think that they are doing a very different kind of work, but also sound historical work that I think is useful and important.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems to me that the way forward is really kind of these rather kind of micro studies, because I mean, certainly some of the attempts to produce grand narratives have been, well, I mean, they've been kind of interesting, but very difficult to substantiate in any manner. And even, of course, trying to build a grand narrative, as you said, on a tiny scrap of text, whether it's papyrus or otherwise, is also deeply problematic. Can we come to your own work, and particularly your recent book, The Rebel and the Imam? I think it's Rebel and the Imam in Early Islam, which, like all good titles, has to rhyme.
Yeah, well, it's my attempt at mirroring classical Arabic titles.
Yes. So, what are you trying to do in this book?
So this is so in a lot of ways, this is a continuation of a project that began way back in grad school, because I spent a good deal of time trying to argue my way out of Hagerism and other types of sources. So I mean, I spent a long time trying to work out a defense of the source material. And then I went to Princeton. I studied with Michael Cook because I was like, if I can convince that guy, then hey, I got something, because he's the king. And so, but what I found is that the ways in which I was engaging the material didn't really make complete sense to me. I mean, one sort of begins to go in circles. The first stage for me was to just take material and ask different questions, and that was my first book. It was about taking legal hadith and using legal hadith to test a narrative about early Islam.
Yeah.
But as I spent some time, especially here in Columbia, where everybody does theory, and if you don't do theory, then you're a bit of you're on the edge. I mean, it really was a culture shock to go from Princeton, where they read Orientalism sarcastically, to Columbia, where they read it sacramentally, right? Yeah. It's a very different way. So it is in a lot of ways. So then I began just thinking about other questions, like questions about the nature of history and historical writing, and a lot of those questions came to me after I found myself in Columbia. Like, what does it mean to write history? What is the craft of writing history really about? What do these words mean? What are our assumptions about this? And as I had more exposure to South Asian scholars, to be perfectly honest, amongst others, I began to think about whether we truly understand what the aims and the goals of these writers in early Islam really were. And that sort of thrust me into late antiquity, because one of the big fads in the study of early Islam is to link everything to late antiquity, and to a certain degree it's a positive development, but there need to be some limits, I think. But regardless, I began reading a lot about late antique historiography, and one of the things I found was that this idea of, and this might be obvious to you, but this idea that the end of historical writing is veracity, or the depiction of the past in a way that preserves its intricate details. That kind of understanding of what the past is not. I mean, it's definitely not there in late antiquity, and it's probably European post 19th century, this idea of that being the primary aim of historical writing.
It's truth in what happened, which is, von Ranke. I mean, it's, it's
yeah,
what's often kind of presented
yeah.
as the standard, the German standard of history. Yeah.
Exactly. So then I just started thinking, what's going on here, and drawing on the late antique history, and particularly work of people like Julie Maysami, who talked about rhetoric within Persian historiography of a later period. I began to just try to engage these literary sources in a different way. So the whole purpose of the book isn't necessarily to give a solution out of the source issue at all. It's to say, well, maybe we should rethink what the project of historical writing is in early Islam, with reference to what late antique historiography looked like. And what does that look like? So what that looks like is an emphasis on meaning and meaningfulness over truth, or what Stephen Colbert in the US anyway calls truthiness. It seems to me that what these writers are doing is they're striving towards truthiness, right? So they're not looking to depict exactly what happened in the past. They're using a template of a historical narrative and changing it and playing with it to put forward meaning. And I mean, a couple of things that flow from that is, one is that there has to be a template in place. And so it's what I call in the book a core narrative, but which, if I had more courage, I would call a myth. Because in the late antique world, that we're talking about is a myth. So that doesn't mean that it's constructed or created.
It's something which bears the essential meaning.
Exactly.
I mean, this is very much kind of Bernard Williams territory as well, because it's philosophers have this massive problem dealing with what truth is, but no one denies that the notion of truthfulness, truthiness, as you want to call it, is actually essential to human life.
Yeah, I mean, I when I explain it to my students, sometimes what I say is, so the story of me getting married. I always bring up the story of me getting married. So let's say that I go to Pakistan, and my wife's family's in Pakistan, and I propose. Yeah. Right, and my wife doesn't say anything, because in Pakistan you don't say anything, and the silence is approval. It's the same thing in Islamic laws. A woman's silence is approval. So she doesn't say anything when we get married. Now, I'm in the middle of America, in Oklahoma, let's say, and somebody says to me and my wife, explain how you got married. And I tell them, I went to Pakistan, I proposed, she didn't say anything, and we were married. Yeah. That feels coercive in the context of
it would certainly raise questions, yes.
Exactly. But if I were to say, I went to Pakistan, I proposed, she accepted, the first story is more literally true, yes, but the second story is more truthful. And I would say that it seems to me that what these historical narratives that we have are doing, and there's a lot of conditions on what I'm saying, so it's not across the board. There's genre differences, there's other types of differences, but what they seem to be doing is to be taking a known narrative and giving it a meaning which they think is both significant, it creates significance, but it also endows this event with a very particular sense of purpose. And I think you find this and what I do in the book is I take 3 cases, and in all 3 cases I look at a span of historians or historical writers, and then I will compare what they're doing. And what I find is that whereas the core narrative or the myth stays the same from author to author, what changes is the interpretive framework around it, and that is the significance and the meaningfulness. And you see competing stories that emerge. And I would argue that it's in that competition where the value, or it's in that contestation of meaning, where the real, sort of the focal point of history really is in early Islam. And so it's all about, it's not about whether a particular conversation happened. It's about what the meaning of that conversation is. And I think audiences understood that. And that's another big thing. It's not as if this is just, I mean, this is the thing that, what you call the skeptics, what I call the revisionists. The argument that's often made is that this is distortion. This is people trying to fool other people, that this is, in some ways a conspiracy. But I would argue that, the audiences for these narratives completely understood what they were reading. They could disentangle what was historical and what was interpretive in ways that perhaps we can't 1,000 years, after the fact. And so I would argue that there's nothing nefarious about this at all. It was just what was understood to be the purpose of historical writing.
But I mean, what would be the limit of that? I mean, you could say that maybe the first generation or so of those who were engaging with that could distinguish between meaning and literal sense. But I mean, surely at some point there's a loss of that, or is there some kind of collective historical memory that's at work? Which, I mean, one of your professors recently wrote this defense of historical memory. Hossein Mudarris wrote this article recently, which actually sounds like a defense of the concept of tawatur. But
that's what it was, yes.
Yeah, but the way he presented it, he said it was a defense of historical memory, and that's what it sounds like.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think that there is I think that there. Have you ever? I mean, the thing is this. So, have you ever read? And this is going to sound like a very trite comparison, but have you ever actually read Little Red? Little Red. No, let's go with Goldilocks. Have you ever read the story of Goldilocks for real?
No, of course not.
But you know the story. You know the story.
Yeah, and of course I know that with many of these fairy tales, the original version is a lot more horrific.
But that's not the point. But but if I were to tell you that story, and I were to tell it in a different way, you would know that I'm telling it in a different way.
Yeah.
But I think that these kinds of narratives of early Islam, especially the important ones, but for scholars, maybe even the ones that we don't see as important, I think that they were just broadly known. There's no way I can prove that to you. There's no way I can prove that to anyone. But I think that they were broadly known, and so I think that there definitely has to come a time where things change, and it might even be over a certain number of generations. But in the early period, I think that these things are, when it comes to the memory of, and I try to stay away from the Prophet and the early caliphs, but once we get a little bit past that to the fitnas, I think that these stories are something that are so ingrained within the consciousness of these scholarly audiences that they would recognize what the story was, and they would also recognize what the change was. And this is just, I mean, a lot of what I'm saying is super conditioned in the book. So bear in mind that I'm throwing out crazy thoughts here, but if you want to know like the ways in which I'm qualifying this, you should look at the book. But I was going to say the Quran does very similar things to narrative. So, I mean, if you were to take, for example, the story of Lot and Abraham, and you read it in the Hebrew Bible, then lots of stuff happens. And for example, these messengers show up. You think from God. Abraham feeds them. They eat. They're very happy. They go away. They're going to go destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham has a conversation with God, and he negotiate down the price that needs to be, like how many righteous people have to exist, right? That story. Now, if you read the Quranic story, little subtle changes are made in that story, right? The people who visit Abraham, the guests, they don't eat. Why don't they eat? Well, partly because this idea of the divine realm interacting with the material realm is seen as being problematic. And then Abraham doesn't get a chance to negotiate with God. When he begins to negotiate with God, God tells him to basically stop talking because he has no role in this. I mean, there's an argument happening here in the Quran, but that argument doesn't make sense unless you already know the story from the basis of the Hebrew Bible. And I think it's always difficult to go from the Quran to historical writing, but I do think that similar sort of play is happening with respect to narrative when you look at some of these historical sources. And I mean, part of the problem that I see and that I struggle with is that the historical sources that we have are themselves composites. So what we might
Yeah.
have is just layer after layer after layer of people constructing frameworks upon other frameworks.
Mm.
And so, the archaeology of narrative gets you to a place where sometimes it becomes very, very tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. That's extremely interesting, and I think certainly this kind of rethinking what we mean by history is absolutely central to
Yeah.
this, and I think certainly there's I think there's still probably people in the study of early Islam who really do think that we're reading texts to discover, the smoking gun, or the original thing which tells us what it really was like,
Yeah.
and that seems to be terribly futile.
Well,
So,
I mean, one of the things I talk about at the end of the book is that I don't think I'm right. I
right.
don't think I'm right. But I mean, I do think that we need to start asking different questions of the material.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, the purpose of the book is just to somebody has to be in the early wave and be like, hey, maybe we need to start looking at this in different ways.
Yeah.
And that person is often very, very wrong. And the group of people are often very, very wrong.
Sure.
But I just want to open up sort of a category of questions that would make sense of the literary sources. And that's not to say that the work that we have other people are doing on papyri and other historical narratives and inscriptions and coins and all of this stuff. That is very, very valuable. But we have this entire corpus of literary sources. We
Mm.
can't just use them, put them to the side and say we're going
Yeah.
to use everything else. There has to be a way to engage with this. And part of that is for us to engage with the nature of the material itself. And it's something that everybody else, all these other fields have already done. They've already come to terms with the way that they think epistemologically about the sources themselves. We are still stuck in a very different place where you have either you believe them or you don't. I mean,
And that's not terribly helpful. And certainly, I think the idea that a historical text can be doing lots of different kinds of things is certainly, from those who study kind of uh, middle period or kind of early modern, say, Persian texts, it's like really obvious. Of course, a
Yeah.
history is not just saying what happened, but
Mm,
it's presenting an ideological worldview, it's presenting a political theory,
mm.
it's presenting a whole set of ways in which an essential truth unfolds in the cosmos. And
So let me tell you a story, a funny story. So I was presenting about 2 years ago. I was presenting sort of parts of this book at a conference in London. It was Sarah Savant at Aga Khan. They had this Arabic Pasts conference,
yeah,
and one of the three case studies I have, I was going to present it, and Conrad Hirschler was in the audience,
yeah,
and I presented it, and I said similar things. And at the end, he goes, "But we know all this," and I was like, yes, you know all this because you work in a period where people have actually come to terms with these questions. If I were to go into a room full of early Islam folks and I would present the exact same material, they would think I was insane. So I mean, it's one of these things where the study of early Islam has been so siloed that even if you go 300 years in the future of the same field,
yeah.
of people who do the
A
exact
different set
same
of
thing.
questions. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, that's been very interesting. Let me just ask as a last thing. So, what next? What are you going to do next?
I'm going to raise my children. I mean, I have I mean, I've written 3 books in 7 years,
Right.
and those are the 3 things I was interested in doing when I first got
Okay.
here. So when I first began graduate study, there were a few ideas I had. One had to do with memory, one had to do with history, and these 3 projects that I have now have sort of flowed from those 2 interests that I've had. Now, I think I want to take some time to sort of take a step back and think about what I want to do next. I have one idea in particular, and that is there's a collection of Zaidi. There's an ikhtilaf work
Right.
of Zaydism in Kufa in the 3rd and 4th century,
Right.
and we also have a hadith collection of Zaydis in Kufa a little bit earlier. And I'm interested in trying to see if I combine the ikhtilaf work with the hadith work, if I can do sort of a close range analysis of Zaydi communities within Kufa. So, my first book was a lot about the diversity within the city of Kufa itself. And one of those contingents of diversity was the Zaydis. But I think that within the Zaydis, there was an incredible amount of internal diversity. And I
Yeah.
think that there are ways to sort of map out those legal communities in ways that I think would be interesting. So that's just something, but that is a kernel of a thought, of an idea that I haven't even really begun to develop yet. I just want to read. I'd like to read for a while.
Someone asked a question just earlier if with respect to this book of yours, The Rebel and the Imam, whether there were other case studies that you considered and you didn't go with in the end, or was it always about these three case studies?
There were other case studies I had thought about, but the reason I ended up choosing these three was that the first one, Mukhtar,
Yeah.
was mostly about chronographies, and so I could use a lot of the non-Shi source material.
Yeah.
The problem with other case studies, well, and this particular event, Mukhtar, is covered by Shi'i sources. And one of the things I was trying to do in the book was to show that there is no substantive actual difference between Sunni and Shi'i historical writing. It's
Right.
just a matter of the perspective. If you go high enough up, they're doing the same thing. But the other problem with the Shia sources is that they're only interested in themselves. So if I wanted to use Imami sources, I would have to find a topic that dealt with an Imami figure. And so I chose Musa Kazim. And for the Zaydis, I chose Yahya bin Abdullah.
Right.
So there were others, like I was looking at Idris for a second. I looked at parts of the Abbasid Revolution. I looked at parts of a couple of other rebellions that happened in Kufa.
Right.
I looked at the Sa'd Fekh rebellion in Arabia. So there were lots of other cases that I was interested in. But these three ended up they fit together, and I think in a useful way.
I mean, certainly the fact that you've done this stuff on these rebellions, which are quite interesting, is I mean, have you thought about writing a script for a film? You know, I mean,
Well,
the Sahib Fahman one might be quite interesting. I mean, Mukhtar, of course, Mukhtar has been made into this kind of TV series, as I'm sure you know. Which is great TV, whatever one thinks about the narrative.
Well, I spoke to my mom about it because she had seen the Mukhtar one, and then as being who I am, I could not help but as my mom was watching it, being like, "That's not right. That's not right. I don't think that's correct." And finally, my mom told me to just leave the room.
It's all about the truthiness.
Exactly, it is the truth. I will say this: before when I wrote my first book, which has a lot of rebellions in it, Cambridge actually wasn't able. In the contract, it said that I had video game rights to my own work. So I immediately thought of an organizing a rebellion in Iraq sort of video game. So if anyone out there
is one, I mean, isn't that like COD? Isn't that what COD does? And so I'm sure there's a COD which does that.
If someone is listening who can do the work, I'm happy to sign over the rights to that game.
Well, I mean, you know, certainly like historical dramas, as you know, in the Muslim world are like a huge deal, especially during Ramadan.
Yeah.
So there's possibilities there. You know,
there's a lot going on.
Maybe the Rebellion of Zayd or something like that. Yeah, I mean,
I think Sa'd Fekh would be a fun one because the Imamis, the Twelvers, my own people, would not be happy because the final scene with the Imam walking around with the Caliph punishing the Alids might not go over very well.
Yeah.
It's hard to depict taqiyya effectively in a video medium.
You'd have to be creative.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, anyway, Najam, thanks for this. I think that's been a really good discussion. I mean, we could easily go on, but I'm aware that you have your duties, and I need to also make sure that my kids are not killing themselves.
I appreciate it. Thanks for this. This was great.
Thank you for this, and thank you for those who've been listening in. Just to mention that the next one of these conversations is going to be on Monday, when I will be with Matt Melvin Kushki talking about occult science and whether
that'll be fun.
Yeah,
that'll be fun.
That should be quite a good one. Yeah. So, well, thank you again, Najam, and
thank you.
See you in better times and in person.